He wasn't just a criminal mastermind. He was an entrepreneur thriving in one of the most lucrative black market industries America ever created. An industry born not from competition, but from legislation. Prohibition didn't merely outlaw alcohol. It engineered a vacuum, wiped out legitimate suppliers, and delivered the entire pipeline to whoever was daring enough to seize it. That vacuum minted overnight millionaires, rewired local politics, and exposed an economic truth that refuses to retire. When lawmakers choke off a product people want, someone else will step in to provide it. When the 18th Amendment took effect in 1920, banning the production, sale, and distribution of alcohol, it was marketed as a moral victory. Alcohol, reformers insisted, was the root of crime, suffering, and social decay. Remove it, and the nation would rise into a cleaner, safer era. But those promises were ideological, not mathematical. Demand didn't crumble. In many places, it intensified. And whenever demand survives while legal, supply disappears. Prices explode. That widening gap between law and human behavior was the landscape where an empire could be built and where one man saw an opportunity big enough to reshape an entire era. Capone's rise didn't begin with myth or legend. It began with timing. Born in 1899 in Brooklyn to working-class Italian immigrants, he grew up in an environment where survival required more than honesty. It required strategy. By the time he reached his early 20s, he had already absorbed the playbook of organized crime. But it wasn't New York that transformed him. It was Chicago. And Chicago under Prohibition wasn't merely a city with opportunity. It was the heart of an underground economic boom, a black market industrial revolution hiding in plain sight. Alcohol wasn't just a social indulgence anymore. It had become the new oil, scarce, essential, and wildly profitable. And Capone, with his organizational instincts and brutal efficiency, was the perfect architect to dominate the sector. His operation wasn't a loose network of street hustlers selling bottles behind dumpsters. It was a fully integrated top-to-bottom enterprise that would fit comfortably into a business school case study. Breweries, distilleries, transportation routes, buying networks, he controlled each piece of the puzzle. From these channels, liquor flowed into hundreds of speakeasies disguised as soda fountains, dance halls, or respectable storefronts. Each establishment paid not just for alcohol, but for reliability, the assurance that supply would never run dry. Capone's enterprise generated an estimated $100 million annually in 1920s dollars, which today would measure in the billions. But revenue was only half the equation. Capone understood the necessity of legitimacy, or at least the appearance of it. The cash pouring in from bootlegging was illegal and unstable, so he funneled it into restaurants, nightclubs, laundromats, and other businesses where cash naturally moved in and out. These operations served dual purposes. They masked illicit income, and they made Capone appear less like a criminal and more like a civic benefactor. In a city where nearly half the economy had shifted underground, his position became something strange. Part outlaw, part employer, part folk hero. Violence was part of the machine when necessary, but it wasn't the engine. The true engine was management of supply, risk, distribution, and reputation. Capone recognized earlier than most that prohibition wasn't just a law. It was a market distortion big enough to transform an ambitious man into an empire builder. The secret to Capone's dominance wasn't brute force, it was economic intelligence. Before Prohibition, alcohol was an ordinary commodity with ordinary margins. Beer was cheap, wine was common, whiskey was plentiful. But the moment the government declared alcohol illegal, everything changed. Every step in the supply chain now carried risk. And risk, in economics, always demands payment. Bribes for police, bonuses for drivers, protection fees for middlemen, premiums for transport. Suddenly, the price of alcohol skyrocketed, but demand didn't. Americans still drank, in fact. Many drank more, driven partly by the thrill of illegality and partly by unchanged cultural habits. Demand stayed strong, supply constricted, and prices soared. This combination turned alcohol from a consumer good into a luxury commodity, and those controlling its distribution became the gatekeepers of a government-created scarcity. Capone saw what legislators ignored. When lawmakers fight demand with regulation, they don't reduce the market, they merely reshuffle who profits from it. His organization mimicked the architecture of a modern corporation: vertical integration, market dominance, supply chain protection, territorial control, even brand reputation. People trusted Capone's product because it was consistent, safe, and available. But Prohibition created something far larger than profit margins. It engineered a new financial ecosystem, one built on corruption. Money didn't just flow to gangsters. It flowed to police departments, judges, political offices, and even federal agents. Corruption wasn't an accidental byproduct. It was a required cost of doing business. Once public institutions became financially dependent on illicit money, enforcement became less about legality and more about negotiation. By the late 1920s, Capone's influence ran so deep that organized crime and Chicago politics were practically merged. Businesses succeeded or collapsed based on their relationship with the outfit. Rival gangs fought to carve out slices of the distribution market, culminating in violent spectacles like the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, a moment that made headlines but revealed only the visible fraction of the empire. The foundation of Capone's power wasn't bullets. It was cash flow. It was control over the financial arteries of an underground economy built by policy, sustained by demand, and enforced by corruption. And as long as alcohol remained illegal, his empire remained indispensable. But every empire built on policy is vulnerable to policy shifts. By the early 1930s, the national conversation had changed. The Great Depression forced Americans and politicians alike to rethink prohibition. Lost tax revenues suddenly seemed far more urgent than moral purity. Meanwhile, Capone had become a national symbol of lawlessness, the face of a policy failure Congress could no longer ignore. Yet despite his notoriety, his inner operations were practically untouchable. Witnesses were intimidated, records were non-existent, and the business itself was insulated by layers of intermediaries. The government couldn't pierce the bootlegging empire directly, but it could attack the financial skeleton holding it together. In 1931, Capone was convicted of tax evasion, the one crime his accountants couldn't disguise. His downfall wasn't a shootout or a betrayal. It was arithmetic. When Prohibition was officially repealed in 1933, the market that made Capone a billionaire evaporated. Legal breweries returned. Distribution became regulated. Prices dropped. The black market monopoly dissolved overnight, transformed into a taxable industry. One of the most profitable criminal markets in U.S. history became just another regulated business sector. But the economic lesson didn't vanish with it. Prohibition collapsed, not because criminals won, but because the economics were inevitable. Demand ignored the law. Supply adapted. Profit followed. And the same mechanics still shape modern industries today. Take cannabis. For decades, marijuana existed as a massive underground market. Enforcement never eliminated. It merely redirected profits to groups willing to assume the risk. As legalization expanded, those profits shifted to corporations. Taxes flowed to governments. Margins shrank. The pattern mirrors Prohibition almost exactly. Or consider cryptocurrency. In its early, unregulated days, it attracted risk-takers and visionaries operating outside the reach of traditional finance. As regulations tighten, the Wild West margins shrink. Institutional players consolidate the market, and early adopters either cash out or adapt. The same dynamic appears in sectors shaped by sanctions, energy policy, and environmental regulation. Whenever governments restrict supply, whether in oil, rare earth metals, or carbon markets, they don't eliminate demand. They simply create new winners who exploit the gap between law and human behavior. And that gap is the core lesson of Capone's story. Profit lives where policy and demand diverge. Spotting those gaps legally is how modern players get ahead. Third, every market shaped by policy carries its own built-in instability. The same way Prohibition collapsed almost in an instant, today's most lucrative regulatory loopholes can disappear without warning. If your income relies entirely on a legal blind spot, that income is borrowed time. Long-term survival requires spreading risk, not worshiping one opportunity. Capone's rise happened because he read the landscape clearer than almost anyone else. His fall happened because the landscape shifted faster than he could. That principle applies to every modern investor, founder, and analyst. Prohibition died. Capone was removed from the equation. But the cycle that made him powerful, the rhythm of regulation, scarcity, and profit, never ended. It's alive in cannabis, in digital assets, in restricted resources, and in every market where demand refuses to obey policy. History doesn't clone itself, but if you fail to learn from it, it'll run you over. If this changed how you think, hit subscribe. The answers are in the past. I'll help you decode them.